Anything else?
Censored, huh?
Yeah, censored.
It's not censored, it's edited.
Edited.
Alright.
Edited. Well, all right. So I tell you what. So today I thought it would probably be a good. I started talking about stuff and jumping all over the place in the timeline, yeah, last week, and I was not confused at all because I watched lots of Doctor Who episodes, and they're all about time travel and whatnot, and that just confuses the heck out of my wife. And last week she said, "You know what?" And I said, "All right." So today I think we should do it. So I worked out a timeline. So I put a timeline on the wall, and all of these note cards. This is just for my thing, but the timeline is before you on the paper too. So.
But this is prettier.
Well, I know, it's because I had all these different colored note cards, as Heidi will remember, as Pam will remember from the district convention. This is what happens when you have leftover note cards from the district
You
convention.
gotta find something to do.
You gotta find something to do with them. And then, so the timeline is also with you. By the way, all these dates, and Bev made me do this, all the dates are BC, okay? Whether they say BC or not, all the dates are BC, whether on the wall or on
We
the
don't
paper.
have on this, our little thing, a little
Well, then,
character, you know?
then take a pen and draw him on there. But I put him on the wall after I did this, so,
I thought that stood for bicameral.
okay, no, it's all these dates are Beth Cahill.
Yeah.
So,
Are you in trouble now?
so,
So where are you going to this afternoon?
she's leaving to get Aiden, no. So on the first page of the handout, and, the color of the cards is not necessarily color-coded, although it started that way, but, so on the first page of the handout, so this goes all the way back to about 650 or so BC, when Israel started in exile. We heard some weeks back that that the Babylonians came in and they wiped out Jerusalem and took over. Actually, the northern kingdom of Israel fell in 750 something BC, and they were gone. And all those 10 tribes disappeared into the midst of time, and nobody knows what happened to them. They were just totally disappeared off the face of the earth until the Mormons found them in Utah. That's part of the Mormon mythology. But no, we don't really know what happened to them. They just kind of totally disappeared. But the southern tribes lasted for a while until the Babylonians came along. And the dates of these various prophets who are in red there, those are the dates when, approximately when they were active. Doesn't necessarily mean, like for instance, Jeremiah. Did he live from 628 to 580? Maybe they just seem to be the dates when we don't know that he was born in 628, and those are the dates when they were active, or seem to be active. The other thing to say is, these are kind of approximate dates. There's no birth certificate of Jeremiah that says Jeremiah born to date April 3rd, 628 BC, because they wouldn't have known BC to begin with, and they would have said, in the third year of King so and so of Judah. Well, so what was the third year of King so and so of Judah? Well, I don't know. When was King so and so king of Judah? Well, he was king of Judah after so and so. And when he was king of Judah, this was going on in Rome, that was going on in Greece. So we tend to date things in, the ancient world was always, we date things in relationship to other things, and historians tended to do that. So that's kind of the way it worked. If we wanted to be as accurate as we possibly could, we'd do what the Romans did and say, we date everything from from the founding of the city of Rome. That's what they did. They said, when was Rome founded? And we date everything from there. Boom. But we don't do that. So the dates here are Jeremiah 6:28 to 580. That's when he was active. Daniel 6:05 to 536. That's when he was active. Although I'm not sure that we can say that his birth date or his death date. That just seems to be when he was writing, ministering, whatever. Okay, so that's pretty far back, 600 years before Jesus. Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, and Obadiah, they were all in the exile. They were all in Babylon and in Persia. Okay, so the Babylonian Empire goes way back and goes all the way to 538 or so BC, and in starting about 538, the Persians take over Babylon, and that's around the beginning of the Persian Empire. Okay, so the Persians kind of rise up, they take over the Babylonian Empire. And in 538, we can date that pretty closely. Cyrus allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem. So remember we said that in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar was like, I like the Jew, he kind of schwaffled. In one chapter in Daniel, he was, everybody's got to bow down to my idol. And in the next chapter was like, we're going to put Daniel's God on the shelf next to all the other gods. Because, he rescued the men from the fiery furnace. And then in the next chapter, he's like, now everybody's got to bow down to an idol again. So he kind of went back and forth. Cyrus, on the other hand, and the Persians, the way they ran their empire was more like, we're going to conquer you, but we're going to let you have your own religion because we're going to be like benevolent dictators. We're still going to, we'll just let you do your own thing religion-wise as long as you, pay the taxes. So that's kind of what the Persians did. All right. So the Jews go back to Jerusalem at 538 BC, and they restore the temple. They rebuild it in about 516 BC. It gets completed, and so they're back. Okay. This is also about the same time. In about 450 or so, the late 450 to 500s, that we have Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah all happening. Esther happens in the court of the Persians. Okay, if you know the story of Esther, she's one of the wives. She's in the harem of the king of Persia. Okay, and she's supposed to. She's summoned to go to him, and she. Doesn't know whether she should, and her uncle says, yeah. And so they have this whole thing, and Esther really is the story of the beginning of the Jewish festival of Purim, where they cast lots to determine what date to exterminate all the Jews in the Persian Empire, and they end up not exterminating all the Jews, so it becomes a national ethnic festival of the Jews for all eternity. That's the festival of Purim. And then Ezra and Nehemiah are about the last return of all the people of Israel. They had completed the temple, but they hadn't rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. So Nehemiah gets sent back, Ezra and Nehemiah get sent back to restore the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah is the builder. The walls were still in shambles. So he's the builder, he's the one who restores the walls of Jerusalem. And Ezra is the scribe, and he's the one that goes back and discovers that people have still, they're still living in sin. So Nehemiah comes back, he persuades the king of Persia to give him money and people to go back and rebuild the walls, which he successfully does, even though there's a great opposition. Ezra goes back and he discovers that the Jews have intermarried with people of the land, and the first thing he does is he says, everybody that you marry, you got to divorce them all, even if you have kids. You got to divorce them all, because we have to have, we can't do this. This is not the way people of God ought to be. And then they have this big festival, and they read the law, and they read the scripture, and they're rejoicing, and they rededicate the temple, and everybody's crying, and all that other kind of stuff. And that's what goes on in Ezra. And then Malachi is the last of the prophets. And Malachi, Haggai, Zechariah, those prophets, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel, they're all about, we'd like to see the kingdom restored, we'd like to see the people of Israel come back out of exile and all that other stuff. Themes in Haggai and Malachi and Zechariah are all about, let's get going on the rebuilding of the temple. There's one of them that says, why are you living in paneled houses when the temple is still in ruins? There's verses like that show up in those prophets. Why are you living in houses with cedar paneling when the temple of the Lord is still in dust and ashes? Get to work on the temple of the Lord. That kind of stuff. So that's it. And then the Old Testament comes to an end at the end of Malachi. I'll talk about that in a minute. But in the meantime, the Persian Empire is beginning to deteriorate. The Greeks are beginning to rise in power. Okay, the Greeks had a long period of time where they were fighting amongst themselves. If you learned this back when you were in school, the Athenians and the Spartans always fought against themselves all the time. And the Greek city-states were always at war. They only cooperated in the Trojan War, and after the Trojan War, they just fought amongst themselves constantly for centuries, until finally they began to coalesce when the Persians got to be pretty strong. And finally, in 490 BC, they got together in a coalition against the Persians, and they fought the Battle of Marathon, for whom the gas company is named. Okay, and defeated King Darius at the Battle of Marathon, but that wasn't the end of the Persian Empire yet. But that was at least an indication that the Greeks were beginning to get their act together, so to speak. Then the Old Testament comes to an end with Malachi. So this is why I wanted to come here and jump up and down. So we have all these books, Old Testament, 430 BC, and nothing in the Word of God from here all the way over till here when Jesus is born. Okay? Silence from God for 430 years until Jesus shows up, at least as far as Holy Scriptures are concerned. Okay? Now, if you include the Apocrypha, the other books that are some in here, which we'll talk about too, then there's not total silence, perhaps. But if you go with just the Jewish scriptures, then it ends here. I mean, just the Hebrew scriptures. Go with just the Hebrew scriptures. It ends here, and there's nothing until here. So all the rest of this happens in the blank pages that I said in our service. Okay. And this other stuff is kind of important, though, because it kind of sets up everything that goes on in the New Testament. It sets the stage for what happens in the New Testament. Okay, so we're good so far? So let's see what's going on in setting the stage. If we turn to the next page. So, about 430, Malachi dies. About 100 years later, the Persian Empire collapses because of one man, and that's Alexander the Great. Okay, and if we were getting the internet today, the one man, Alexander the Great, arises about 300 or so, 330 BC, played in the movies either by Colin Firth or Richard Burton, depending on how far back you go. Okay. And for some reason or other, in the movies, he always has blonde, curly hair, and I'm not sure why that is. I don't know how historical that is. But in 333 BC is the Battle of Issus between the Greeks and the Persians. That's the end of the Persian Empire and the beginning of what's called the Age of Hellenism, which lasts from here, from the end of the Persian Empire, all the way beyond here. And here I have the age of Rome as around 44 BC with the death of Julius Caesar, picks up here, and Roman Empire begins around the time of the death. Actually, it begins when Augustus becomes emperor and goes on from there. But the age of Hellenism continues for about another 100 years or so in this direction to 100 AD or so. But the age of Hellenism goes here. Now, Hellenism means Greek, okay? Greek stuff. So when Alexander came in, he was bound and determined that everything was going to be Greek civilization. That's what it was, okay? And so everything was Greek. Greek culture, Greek life, Greek language, all that other kind of stuff. In very much, very similar to what the British did when they did their empire in the 1800s, okay? Wherever the Brits landed, the British culture just got imposed on everything. So everybody spoke English, the Brits ruled everything, and, to this day, wherever there was a British empire, there's British culture, okay? You go to India and people speak English. They speak other languages, but they also speak English, okay? You go to Africa, same deal. I mean, it's basically a colonialist, that's what colonialism is. And that's what Alexander did in that whole area. And the whole area, which I can't show you on the screen, the whole area went from what these days would be Greece, and a little bit north of Greece, Macedonia, was Greece, Egypt, Libya, the Middle East, the whole Middle East, Israel and so forth, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way over to parts of India, the north and west parts of India. That's what Alexander's empire covered. I mean, he just ran rampant over that area with his Greek army. And Greek culture covered that whole area. So you can go as far as Pakistan and find Greek temples. Afghanistan, the whole deal. He basically took over, but what he would do is he took over like the Persian Empire, which was already there, and just kind of overlaid Greek culture on top of it. So by the time he was done, and he was only, he started in 330 so AD, he only died 10 years later. He died of something in Babylon in 323. By the time he was done, it was all Greek. So everybody was speaking Greek. I mean, that was the language of the empire. Greek took over, Greek culture, Greek everything. They were all Greeks. Okay? I mean, they spoke their own languages, but it was all Greek culture, just like the Britons did or the English did in the 1800s. Okay? So that's what he did. And when he died in 323, after a while, he had 4 generals. And that were his second in command, these 4 guys, and they divided up the empire into 4 parts. And the 2 who were important were Ptolemy and Seleucus. And Ptolemy took Egypt and the southwestern part, and Seleucus took Syria and basically what we know as the Middle Eastern part. Okay, and so Seleucus took the Middle East, like from, say, Judea, northeast, so what we would call Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, that part. And he took that part, and Ptolemy took the southwest part, Egypt and Libya. And that kind of left Judea caught in the middle. and so they fought over who was going to rule Judea. And the Ptolemies ruled Judea for about 150 years, okay? But it's kind of in a real strategic position because it's a good place to be. It's right at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. It's a good strategic place to be. All the shipping roads go right there you know, and it's not a bad place to be. So the Ptolemies and that whole dynasty ruled in Egypt, and they ruled in Egypt for 300 years. The Ptolemies ruled all the way from 300 down to the time of the Romans, when the Romans kind of came in and took over, and the most famous of the Ptolemies was Cleopatra VII, okay, who slept with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and caused a great war in the process, okay, and was in 2 plays by William Shakespeare, and was played by Elizabeth Taylor. Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Fitting.
Yeah.
Fitting.
Yeah. And then the Seleucids were up in the north, and that whole dynasty, and then Judea was caught in the middle. Okay. Now, in the meantime, here's what else is going on. So this is all going on in the age of Hellenism. The Greeks had control of the whole deal down there. They were fighting it out in the Eastern Mediterranean. I put this in here, these 3 Punic Wars, so-called, in here. Rome versus Carthage, okay, in 3 separate wars, and they're on the timeline. The first war, Rome versus Carthage. Rome was, you know where Rome is. Carthage was right straight south across the Mediterranean in Africa, okay? And Carthage was a big city there, and I put that in there because they were duking it out in the central. The Greeks had all the Eastern Mediterranean going on. Rome and Carthage were duking out in the central Mediterranean. They fought these wars, and the result of it was that Rome won all this, and it was the Romans who then controlled the central and then finally the Eastern Mediterranean. If the Carthaginians had won, we would not have had Roman civilization. We would not have had Latin. We wouldn't have had all that stuff. You'd have learned Carthaginian in Catholic school instead of Latin. Yeah, Shamash. You'd learn all that stuff. Okay. So the winner of this conflict really decided the fate of Western civilization for hundreds of years. Okay, we would have had a Carthaginian civilization rather than a Roman civilization, or European civilization, and you know, who knows how history would have been different. These are critical wars that happened 200 years before Jesus was born, because they decided who was going to be in control of the civilization. And the most famous one, of course, that you don't know about, probably, or you maybe have heard of, was when Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants. Okay, in fact, I said something about Hannibal, and Jackie Moore like that is, oh, he's the one that crossed the Alps with elephants. I said, yeah, that's the guy. He's not the one who, you know, ate people in a movie. Hannibal Lecter. And my other note there says Hannibal's brother was Hasdrubal, okay, whom some of you may know because Hasdrubal also plays baseball. So. You know, if you ever wondered where that guy got his name, you know, where's a name like Hasdrubal come from? You know? It's not Astrobal, that's what we used to think. Wasn't it Astrobal Cabrera or something? Hasdrubal. All right. I know, these are the best jokes I got this week. Groan all you want to. Groan all you want to, but these are the best jokes I got. All right, so the Ptolemies are in Egypt, and they're ruling Judea, but they had Judea until about 198, and then the Seleucids took over in Judea. But in the meantime, I have the note here from about 250 to about 130-ish. So over the course of about 100 years or so, the Septuagint happened, and that's a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures plus a few extras. And that's why I have up there on that green one. I have some when hereabouts the Septuagint happened. Well, there's no publication date. We don't know exactly when. Just, you know, it's not like, you know, it was a release date on Amazon.com or anything like that. It's just, you know, by about 130 BC, we have documents that said, oh, now there's a Greek translation of the Old Testament, I keep saying that. Now there's a Greek translation of Hebrew Scriptures that seems to be appearing here and there. And some of them seem to be originating in Alexandria, which was the major city in Egypt before Cairo was the capital. That was the center of learning and scholarship and excellence, and it was, run by the Greeks. And they translated the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek, plus a few ones that the Hebrews apparently didn't know about. Okay, and so the gold cards up there have some of these additional ones in there, and Larry brought his Bible there, and my other one too. Additions to Esther, a couple of books of Esdras, 4 Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, an extra Psalm, Ecclesiasticus, additions to Daniel that I showed you last time, those extra ones that apparently are not in the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay. And they all come from that time, and particularly from the time of about 165, which we'll talk about. But the Septuagint just kind of, I don't know how to say it, it kind of showed up in the mists of time, and there it was. It's not like a publishing company that lays claim to saying, we did that, but those things just kind of showed up. And there we have it.
Excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead.
By the way, like the NIV, if you read, every once in a while you run into a reference to the Septuagint. Like I'm looking at the first page of Hebrews, and it says, for a particular verse, see the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint.
Yeah.
Which meant that it probably, what we have here, isn't a translation of the Hebrew, but it's a translation of the Septuagint.
Right.
And so it's around,
Right.
and it impacts our Bibles.
Right.
In a few places.
Right. Because there are some places where the Greek version is a little different from the Hebrew version. Not so, I want to say, they're a little, not significantly different so that it would change our doctrine or our faith or our practice any, just so that it changes the words a little bit, but not so that we would say, oh my gosh, we have to change everything that we believe based on this document. I mean, it doesn't work that way. But, they're more supplemental than anything else. I guess I want to say it this way. Have you ever, I've done this sometimes. Have you ever had a book, or read a book where, as you're reading the book, there's a whole bunch of footnotes in the book, whether they're maybe at the bottom of the book, or maybe they're at the bottom of the page, or at the end of the book. There's like notes that explain things in the book, or whatever. Have you ever had a book like that? And then, do you do this? Do you read the notes, or do you not read the notes?
Don't read them.
Depends on how concerning it is.
Depends on what I'm reading.
Yeah.
What I'm reading.
Yeah.
Whether
Interested in it, then you read it.
Bev's Bible,
Just
that
that
Bible that Bev has is full of them.
Yeah, Bev's Bible's like, okay. So I sometimes I think that these extra books that are like in the Septuagint are kind of like those notes. They're good to have, they're nice to have those extra notes, but whether you read them or not probably doesn't really make a whole lot of difference to the main course of the text, or to the course of the main text, okay? I mean, they're there because they're good supplemental material. Okay, that's the way Lutherans have always kind of looked at it. It's good supplemental material, but whether you read them or not really doesn't change the text. Okay? Now, in the Catholic Bible, they're part of the Bible, they're part of the whole text, but Lutherans have always said, yeah, they're more like notes. You know, they give us more material, but
It's a little more detailed.
yeah, a little more details. Now, the exception is probably the couple of books of the first and second Maccabees, because they tell us more information. So if you look at the third page, at the top of the third page, starting in 174 BC, you have this really nasty guy who's the Seleucid ruler of Judea. His name is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. That was his nickname for some reason or other that I've never found out. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, he ruled Judea from 174 to 64. Now, when the Ptolemies were ruling Judea and Egypt, they were just like Alexander. They were like, you know, we want to just paint everything with a layer of Hellenism. We just want to paint everything to look like Greek, but y'all can be Jews as far as we're concerned. That's fine. Just speak Greek. You know, that's fine. Just be Jews, but speak Greek. You know, pay everything in drachmas. You know, that as long as you're Jews, I mean, as long as you do that, that's fine. But the Seleucids were different. They wanted to totally suppress the Jewish culture. They wanted to totally wipe out the Jewish people. They wanted to do it, and you know, they wanted to do that, and especially Antiochus Epiphanes. In the Maccabees, the first and second Maccabees, they talk about how he went into the temple in Jerusalem. He erected a statue of Zeus in the temple. He did sacrifices to Zeus on the altar of God. He did all kinds of things. He would capture, you know, he would arrest Jews and then force feed them pork, you know, and then they would vomit and then he'd force it fit back down their throats, that kind of stuff. There's a story about how he captured a Jewish mother who had like 4 sons and then executed their sons before her very eyes before he finally killed her. You know, that kind of stuff. He's just a terrible, terrible, nasty guy because his only goal was to exterminate the Jews. The guys who ruled Egypt would not have done that. They would have just said, you know, just pay the taxes and speak Greek. That's all I want you to do. But these guys were terrible. And so in about 167 BC, the Maccabees, that's a family name, they led a revolt, and for about 3 years they rebelled against Antiochus, till finally they overthrew him and set up their own government there, their own rule, established the House of Maccabees, and then became known as the Hasmonean dynasty when the actual Maccabees passed the rule on to others. That was the Jewish dynasty. And they ruled Judea until 63. It's not 164 to 163 BC. It's 164 all the way to 63 BC. So the Jews actually ruled themselves for about 100 years in Judea. And during that revolution, Hanukkah happened in 164 BC. When they succeeded in the revolt, they cleansed the temple. This is in the book of Maccabees also. They cleansed the temple. They got the desecration of the thing of Zeus out of there. They cleansed the temple. They restored it. They built it. And then they were going to have a rededication of the temple. And so they had the lamp. It's supposed to be like an eternal light, like we have up there, only it's not electric, it's supposed to have oil. So they had eternal light in the temple, and they had enough consecrated oil for one day. And so they filled the lamp, and they lit the lamp with the consecrated oil, and the lamp burned for 8 straight days. They knew they had enough for one day, but when they lit it, it burned for 8 straight days. And that was a miracle, and that was Hanukkah. That was the first Hanukkah. And so since 164 BC, the Jews have always celebrated Hanukkah, and that's the origin of that. That the miracle that God provided light, it's a festival of light on the restoration of their temple. Okay. And then the Jews continued to rule Judea all the way until 63 BC when the Romans came in and took it over. Okay. But by that time they had got rid of the Seleucids. But by that time, Hellenism, now, Alexander's campaign to establish Greek culture in that whole area had been going on for a couple hundred years, so everybody was speaking Greek. Okay. So by the time, that's from 300 years, now let's go back a little bit further, 300 or so years Alexander started all the way up to the time of Jesus. By the time we get to the New Testament, what language is the New Testament written in? Greek. Why? Because that was the language that everybody was speaking in the Eastern Mediterranean. Everybody was speaking Greek. Okay. It's because of Alexander. Okay. Everybody thinks that maybe the New Testament was written in Latin, but it wasn't, because the Romans didn't get there until about 60 BC. So they had a chance to impose Latin on them yet. Everybody was speaking Greek for 300 years before that. See? That's why the New Testament was written in Greek. That whole area, from Greece, from Egypt, all the way over to India, everybody was talking Greek. That's why the New Testament, and that's why everywhere Paul went, he would preach in Greek. He'd preach in Hebrew to the Jews, and then he'd go out in the marketplace and preach Greek. In the meantime, just a couple other things, so that, because these are some things that maybe from history and whatnot. Finally, Rome destroys Carthage in 146 BC. That's the end of that, and things became Roman from then on. 70 years later, you got the war against Spartacus. Okay, and all men know about Spartacus, right? I am Spartacus, or Kirk Douglas. Okay. I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus.
Romans take over control of Judea in 63, and then you get all the Roman jazz in there. But then Julius Caesar comes onto the scene. He's the big general. He conducts some wars in Gaul, which is France, in the 50s BC. And of course, he writes a book about this, Caesar's Gallic Wars. Here it is, in case you want to read it. In Latin and in English, by the way, it's got maps and everything. With its famous opening line, Gallia est omnis divisa in partes tres, which means Gaul as a whole is divided into three parts, which all the Latin students said: North Gaul, Central Gaul, and the Riviera. But it actually continues as Gaul as a whole is divided into three parts. The place where the Belgians live, where the Aquitanes live, and where the Celts live, okay, or in the Latin language, people who have a lot of Gaul. That's that's what it says. And then in 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon to start the Civil War, and said famously, "The die is cast." And then in 40, and he became the first, pretty much. That's when he was the dictator of Rome, and it was the end of the Republic. And then they assassinated him in 44 BC. I should have put, you can write this in, beware the Ides of March.
15 March.
Yeah, 15th of March. And in the meantime, over in Judea, the Romans were handling Judea at the time. Herod the Great was appointed king of Judea in 47 BC, and he ruled until Jesus was born, depending on when you think Jesus was born, but he was appointed in 47 BC. Herod the Great, or as some people call him, Herod the Paranoid. Okay, because he's the one that the wise men came to and said, "Where's the one born king of the Jews?" And he said, king of the Jews, we gotta get rid of that kid. And sent the wise men to find out, and wanted to kill him.
He was Roman.
He was not. Herod was appointed by the Romans, but he was not Roman. He was not Jewish either. He was, well, the ethnic term was Idumean, and I think that's like an Arabic tribe or some kind of nomadic tribe from somewhere or other. And I'm not real sure where it was, but he was not Jewish, he was not Judean, he was not Roman. He was from God knows where they found this guy. Okay? Plucked out of a cabbage patch somewhere.
Must
And-
have suited him fine, though.
Probably, you know, he probably had the money to be appointed king, or his family had the money for him to be appointed king, because he was the king and his son Agrippa was the king after him, and by the time John the Baptist rolled around, Herod Agrippa was the, you know, I mean, it was a continuous thing like that, and they were slimy, okay? They were slimy, these guys. Okay, the last page, Octavius was declared Augustus in 27 BC, so Caesar Augustus, that's the beginning of the Roman Empire, the age of Rome, and the slow decline of the age of Hellenism. So that's when the Roman Empire actually starts. The birth of Jesus Christ, maybe 6 BC-ish, maybe 4 BC-ish, so Jesus was actually born 4 to 6 years before Christ, depending on who you asked. Okay, just the timeline, you know, depending on who writes it. And then the year 0, there is no year 0. The calendars just jump from 1 to BC to 1 AD. There is no year 0 in the timings, so it's just how it works out. Yeah. So there's no
Do you
year
know
0.
when we started this AD and BC idea?
Yeah.
Was that in like?
It was in about, when did they start the BC-AD idea? I'm not real sure. There was an English bishop.
Oh,
I mean, there was, you know, one of the sources was there was an English bishop whose name was Ussher, who developed a pretty comprehensive timeline of Scripture. And I'm not sure when he lived, 1600s,
oh,
1700s.
that's late.
Something like that, yeah, I think. And he was the one who said this. He was also the one who said that that the Earth is like 6,000 years old. I might be late on him, but you know, the earlier timelines were like, you know, the earliest timelines were that, and I'm going to blame it on Bishop Ussher, because he's the one that usually gets the blame for that kind
So
of
it was
stuff.
after Martin Luther with the, sometime.
Yeah, I think it was after Luther that they would have said BC AD. But you know, I take it back. That's who comes to mind off the top of my head, which is right about 85% of the time. But you know, because earlier on, prior to somebody like Bishop Ussher setting up a timeline, somebody would have said, in the 3rd year of the reign of Augustus as Caesar, this or that happened.
Oh, okay.
You know, so I go, okay, when did Augustus become Caesar? You know, well, the Romans would have said, not 27 BC, they would have said, what year was Rome founded? Okay, so in X number of years after the founding of the city of Rome is when Augustus became Caesar. And they would have marked it from there. So when the BC AD thing started, I don't know.
Google it.
Google it.
Google it.
Yeah, we know everything's on.
You know, BC, having said that, BC used to mean before Christ, and AD means Anno Domini, which means in the year of the Lord. There's been a common push, a push recently amongst secular people
Sure.
to have BCE, which is supposed to mean before the common era, and now CE to be common era, which, just seems to me to be disingenuous.
Well, it's been good enough all these years. Why
Yeah,
change it?
I would
That
think.
doesn't mean anything.
I would think.
I know.
Correct.
Gotta
Yeah.
wipe out
Yeah.
Christ on everything.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So anyway, this is what's been going on, or what goes on between the end of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this is where, so anyway, last week so one of the things that we're saying, or one of the things that they've said was, the Septuagint just kind of floats into existence, and I'm not sure how, except that the Jews, in this age of Hellenism, when Alexander wanted everything to be Greek, it was probably a good idea for the Jews to have a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. So let's translate the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek, because, that's a good thing to do in this age when everything was becoming Greek. And so they took the Hebrew Scriptures, and they had a bunch of other things that were floating around in the synagogues. And so let's translate them into Greek also, and so that kind of happened. But then the question, and this is the one we talked about several weeks ago, was this. Okay, so Daniel. Okay, so here's the book of Daniel, and so a question from some people is this, from some scholars is this. Where's Alexander? Here's Alexander. So take a look at Daniel chapter, if you have a Bible, Daniel chapter, it's Daniel chapter 8, verses 20 and 21. Okay, Daniel chapter 8, 20 and 21 and 22.
6:30.
Yeah, 6:33. Daniel chapter 8, 20, 21, and 22. Somebody read those, please.
The two-horned ram that we saw represents the king of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The four horns that replaced the one that was broken off represents four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power.
Okay? All right. So, just for fun, let's assume we got a guy here. Okay. So the question is the question sometimes is asked by scholars and other people, when was Daniel written? So here we got a guy who we'll assume is Daniel for the time being. He's standing over here, Daniel, 605 to 536. And he's writing about the king of Greece, the king of Persia, and four kingdoms and all this other stuff. As we're looking at this whole timeline, 600 years of history, we could see Daniel, and we could see Alexander, and we could see four kingdoms right after Alexander, okay? And we could see Daniel's here and these four kings. So what do we do with that? If Daniel is standing here and writing about things that happen over here. So, if Daniel is standing here and writing about that, we're saying, as Christians, we're saying, well, that looks like prophecy. Because Daniel is standing here and he's looking about stuff that's happening off into the future, and God is telling him, you write that, and that looks like prophecy. We're saying, how can Daniel say that real clearly so that he can clearly say, okay, we got a king of this, we got a king of that, they're going to fight, 4 kingdoms are going to come out of that. I don't know, but that's how prophecy works. If God wants to give it to him that clearly, that's how prophecy works. Okay? Then we got other people who say, nah, you know what? We think that maybe that section of Daniel was written by somebody who was living at this time when this guy was being real mean and nasty, evil, mean and wicked to the Jews, and they needed somebody to give them hope. So maybe this guy was pretending to be Daniel,